This is the Brewster Buffalo. In the summer of 1942, over the Pacific it was being shredded out of the sky by Japanese fighters in the single worst day American marine aviation would ever suffer. Pilots called it a flying coffin. One survivor said no commander should ever send a man into combat in one. But that very same summer, on the other side of the planet, this exact same aircraft was quietly becoming one of the most successful fighters ever flown. Same plane, two opposite endings. This is how both were true. To understand how a single design earned both of those reputations, you have to go back to the mid-1930s, to a United States Navy that was standing on the edge of an enormous change and didn't quite realize it yet. In 1935, the Navy issued a requirement for a new carrier fighter to replace the Grumman F-3F. Now, the F-3F was a biplane, two wings, fabric and metal, open to the elements. It was the kind of aircraft that had ruled the skies since the First World War, and to most people in 1935, that was simply what a fighter looked like. But a quiet revolution was already underway. Engineers were realizing that the future belonged to the monoplane. One wing instead of two, a smooth all-metal skin, an enclosed cockpit, and landing gear that folded up into the airframe to cut drag. And the company that answered the Navy's call with the boldest version of that idea was a small outfit operating out of a factory in Queens, New York, called the Brewster Aeronautical Corporation. Their design was the XF-2A, one led by an engineer named Dayton Brown. It was a stubby, barrel-chested little monoplane, and when it flew against the competition, it won. Interestingly, the aircraft it beat in that competition was an early version of the Grumman F-4F, the plane that would one day be famous as the Wildcat. So the Buffalo didn't just win a contract, it became the first monoplane fighter ever to enter service with the United States Navy. In 1939, it went to sea aboard the USS Saratoga, and for a brief window, it really was the future. Now, here is where we should talk about what actually made the Buffalo good, because it's easy, looking back, to assume it was always a bad airplane. It wasn't. Think of the difference between an old sailing ship and an early steamship. On paper, both float and carry cargo, but they belong to two different eras of technology. That was the gap between the biplane and the Buffalo. The Buffalo was fast for its moment, hitting just over 300 miles an hour. It was nimble in a way that delighted the pilots who flew it. One of them famously said the little fighter could practically roll inside a telephone booth, meaning it could turn and twist with a lightness that felt almost playful. At its heart sat a Wright Cyclone radial engine, a big air-cooled power plant that was reliable and well understood, from the same family of engines that hauled the airliners and bombers of the day. Cooling it was simple, because the rushing air did all the work, and that kind of ruggedness was a real virtue in a fighter that would spend its whole life slamming down onto the wooden deck of a carrier. And the whole package, the retractable gear, the metal skin, the enclosed cockpit, represented exactly the direction every serious Air Force on Earth was about to take. To be fair to the men who chose it, in 1938 the Brewster Buffalo was a reasonable, even forward-looking bet. The problem was never really where the airplane started. The problem was how fast the world moved after that. Because in the late 1930s, aviation was advancing at a pace that is almost hard to imagine today. A cutting-edge fighter could become dangerously outdated in the span of about 2 years. Then war came to Europe, and with it came brutal, unforgiving lessons about what a combat aircraft really needed to survive. The reports coming back were consistent. Fighters needed armor plating behind the pilot to stop bullets. They needed self-sealing fuel tanks, so a single tracer round wouldn't turn the aircraft into a fireball. They needed heavier guns, more ammunition, more fuel, better radios. Every one of those lessons was correct, and every one of them added weight. This is where the Buffalo's story turns into a slow, quiet tragedy of engineering. The Navy asked Brewster to add all of that protective equipment, and Brewster did. But the engine driving the airplane stayed roughly the same. Picture a distance runner who is suddenly told to carry a backpack, then a second backpack, then a set of ankle weights, and to run just as fast as before, on the same breakfast. That was the Buffalo. Each new version got heavier while the power stayed nearly flat. The early models climbed and turned beautifully. The final Navy version, the F-2A3, was overloaded, sluggish to climb, and unstable with landing gear that struggled under all the extra weight. The very improvements meant to keep pilots alive were strangling the airplane's performance. And then there was the company building it, which is a whole separate disaster. The Brewster Aeronautical Corporation was, to put it politely, a mess. The factory in Queens was cramped and inefficient, poorly suited to the mass production a World War demands. Quality control was so bad that the Navy grew alarmed. Deliveries ran hopelessly behind schedule. Management overpromised what it could never deliver, and there were serious allegations of corruption swirling around the leadership, including figures who had already served prison time for illegally selling arms overseas. It got stranger still. Because the engine maker, Wright, couldn't produce new Cyclone engines fast enough to meet wartime demand, Brewster took a shortcut that tells you everything about the situation. They fitted some Buffaloes with reconditioned engines, in some cases pulled out of civilian DC-3 airliners. So here was a frontline fighter meant to face the best aircraft in the world, powered in part by second-hand airline engines. The whole operation had grown so dysfunctional that in the spring of 1942, the United States Navy did something almost unheard of in American history. It seized the company outright and put its own man in charge. That is how badly things had gone wrong on the factory floor. Now the airplane had to go to war, and the results were exactly what you might fear. The British had ordered the Buffalo II, and quickly decided it was no match for the German fighters over Europe. So they shipped it to what they assumed was a quieter theater, the Far East, to defend Malaya, Burma, and the great fortress of Singapore. To squeeze a little more performance out of the overloaded planes, ground crews stripped them down, swapping in lighter guns, cutting the ammunition, even reducing the fuel. It wasn't enough. When Japan attacked in December 1941, the Buffalo ran headfirst into the Mitsubishi Zero, one of the finest fighters of the entire war. Flown by superbly trained Japanese pilots, the Zero was faster, climbed better, and turned tighter. Commonwealth pilots fought with real courage, and they did shoot down around 30 Japanese aircraft before Singapore fell in February 1942. But the airplane was simply outclassed. The same grim story played out for the Dutch, whose Buffaloes were overwhelmed defending the islands of the East Indies. And then came Midway. This is the moment that sealed the Buffalo's reputation forever, and it deserves to be told carefully, because real men died here. A squadron of United States Marines, designated VMF 221, the Fighting Falcons, had been sent out to help defend Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of American territory in the middle of the Pacific. They were flying the F-2A3, the heaviest, most overloaded version of the Buffalo, many with those worn, reconditioned engines. By this point in the war, these pilots had a fairly clear idea of what they were up against. Word had already filtered back across the Pacific about how the nimble Japanese Zero flew, and how their own tired Buffaloes measured up against it. They flew the mission anyway, because Midway was a vital American outpost that had to be held, and the Buffalo was the airplane they had. On the morning of June 4, 1942, radar picked up a massive incoming Japanese strike, well over 100 aircraft heading for the island. Roughly 25 Marine fighters climbed to meet them, a mix of Buffaloes and a handful of Wildcats. What happened next was not a battle so much as a slaughter. The Japanese escort of Zeros fell on the Marines from above, and the outmatched Buffaloes had nowhere to hide. In a matter of minutes, 13 Buffaloes and 2 Wildcats were shot down. 15 of the 25 American pilots were killed, including the squadron's commanding officer, Major Floyd Parks. Of the Buffaloes that managed to make it back, only 2 were fit to ever fly again. It remains the heaviest single loss of Marine aviators in the entire Second World War. The Marines were brave, and they did take a few of the enemy down with them. But they had been sent up in the wrong airplane, outnumbered, against the best in the world. Afterward, one of the surviving pilots, Captain Philip White, wrote a line that has followed the Brewster Buffalo ever since. He said that any commander who sends a pilot into combat in an F-2A should consider that pilot lost before he even leaves the ground. It is one of the most damning things a pilot has ever said about his own aircraft, and for most people, that is where the story of the Brewster Buffalo ends. The worst fighter of the war. A death trap. A cautionary tale. But it isn't where the story ends, because thousands of miles away, in the forests and frozen lakes of Finland, the very same airplane was writing an almost unbelievable second chapter. Here is the piece that changes everything. When Finland ordered its Buffaloes, it ordered an earlier, lighter version, known as the Model 239. Crucially, this variant never received the heavy naval equipment or the mountain of extra weight that had crushed the American versions. No arrestor hook, no life raft, none of the protective gear that turned the F-2A3 into a flying anchor. The Finnish Brewster was light, quick and agile, much closer to the delightful little fighter the design had been at the very beginning. Those planes reached Finland after being assembled in Sweden, and they went to a fighter squadron called Lentolaivu 24, when war with the Soviet Union flared up again in June 1941. In what the Finns call the Continuation War, this handful of buffaloes formed the backbone of the entire Finnish fighter force, and what they did with them defies belief. Finnish pilots flying the Brewster claimed something in the region of 477 aerial victories against fewer than 20 losses in combat. Depending on which source you trust, that works out to a kill ratio of better than 26-1, and by some accounts higher still. To put that in perspective, that is among the finest records of any fighter type flown by any nation in the whole war. The Finns fell in love with the airplane. They gave it an affectionate nickname, Taivaan Helmi, which translates as the Pearl of the Sky. Out of Finland's roughly 96 flying aces, more than a third earned that status flying the Brewster. Among them were legends. Ilmari Juutilainen, who scored 94 victories over his career, the highest tally of any non-German fighter pilot in history, flew the Buffalo and adored it, describing the little planes as fat but fast, like bees, with speed and agility and a real sting. Hans Wind, another of the great Finnish aces, scored 39 of his victories in the Brewster, more than any other pilot on Earth, and simply called it a fine aircraft. So how on earth can the same basic airplane be a flying coffin over Midway and the Pearl of the Sky over Finland? This is the real lesson buried inside the Buffalo's story, and it has almost nothing to do with the airplane being secretly good or secretly bad. It comes down to circumstances. First, the airplane itself was different. The Finnish Model 239 was hundreds of pounds lighter than the overloaded F-2A3 the Marines were forced to fly. That weight was the difference between a nimble fighter and a sluggish one. Second, the Finns were fighting a different enemy. Where the Americans faced the world-beating Japanese Zero, the Finns were often up against older, slower Soviet aircraft, biplanes and early monoplanes that the light Brewster could readily outfight. Third, the pilots were extraordinary. Finland deliberately kept only its very best men in the cockpit, seasoned veterans who flew clever, disciplined tactics. Rather than get dragged into a turning contest, they hunted in loose pairs, diving down out of the sun, striking hard and climbing back out of danger before the enemy could react. It was patient, professional flying, and it turned a modest airplane into a deadly one. Fourth, the ground crews performed small miracles, keeping those aging airframes flying in brutal sub-zero cold, where, as it happens, the frigid air even helped keep the engines from overheating. And most of the combat took place at lower altitudes, exactly where the Buffalo felt most at home. There is a strange, almost poetic image at the heart of all this. In that same month of June 1942, on one side of the world Finnish Brewsters were climbing into the sky to fight, while on the other side, near Midway Atoll, American Brewsters were falling out of it. The identical machine, two utterly different fates, separated by nothing more than who was flying it, who they were fighting, and how much weight it was forced to carry. In the end, a little over 500 Brewster Buffaloes were ever built, and the Brewster Company itself did not survive the war. But the airplane left behind something far more interesting than a simple verdict of good or bad. So what do we actually learn from the Brewster Buffalo? We learn that the men who chose it were not fools. They made a reasonable decision in 1938 and were overtaken by a pace of change almost no one could keep up with. We learn how a well-meaning pile of improvements, each one sensible on its own, can quietly destroy the very thing they were meant to protect. And most of all, we learn that a machine is only ever half the story. The other half is the situation you put it in. The same airplane that broke the hearts of American Marines became a national legend to the pilots of Finland. It was never simply the worst plane or the best. It was both, and understanding why is far more valuable than any label. If you enjoy these stories, the ones where the truth turns out to be stranger and more human than the legend, then stick around. There are a lot more of them, and the history of flight is full of machines that were nothing like their reputations. I'll see you in the next one.